What if the one place Iran thought was already broken turns out to be the place that decides how this entire war ends? For weeks, Iranian state media told its own people a simple story. They said the American president backed down. They said he blinked. And then a small island off the Iranian coast lit up again, and that story fell apart in real time. Before we go further, if you want more breakdowns like this one, tap that like button right now, hit subscribe, and send this to one person who still thinks this war is almost over. It isn't. Let's get into it. To understand why this island matters so much, we need to go back to how this war actually started, because the version most people remember is not the full picture. This conflict began in late February this year, when a coordinated wave of Israeli and American strikes hit targets across Iran. Among the officials killed in that opening wave was Iran's supreme leader, a man who had led the country for nearly 4 decades. For a government built almost entirely around the idea that its top cleric was untouchable, that single moment was already a shock nobody had fully prepared for. Within days, an internal process began to choose a successor, and his son eventually stepped into the role. But the country he inherited was already at war, and that war has not slowed down since. The succession itself was not simple either. With dozens of senior officials reportedly killed in that same opening wave, an interim leadership arrangement had to be formed almost immediately, just to keep basic decisions moving while a formal process played out. For a government that had spent nearly 4 decades presenting its top leadership as stable and untouchable, that scramble alone told the world something important. The system had been built around one man staying in place indefinitely, and it had no clean answer for what happens when that assumption suddenly disappears. From that first week onward, a pattern set in. Iran would fire missiles or drones at American bases and at ships moving through the region. American forces and their partners would intercept most of it, absorb whatever got through, and respond with strikes that grew larger over time, not smaller. Round after round, this cycle repeated itself. And running underneath almost every single one of these rounds was one location that kept coming up again and again, a stretch of coastline barely 5 miles long, sitting a short distance off Iran's coast in the Persian Gulf. On a map, it looks like nothing, a small curve of land surrounded by open water. But that small curve of land handles somewhere close to 9 out of every 10 barrels of crude oil that Iran exports to the world. Almost every dollar that funds the country's missile program, its military, and its network of allied groups across the region passes through the terminals built on that island first. It has done so for more than 60 years, ever since the site was developed into a deep water oil terminal, because the mainland coast nearby is too shallow for the largest tankers to dock. In mid-March, American forces struck that island directly. Officials described it as one of the most significant strikes of the war so far, saying more than 90 separate military positions on the island were destroyed in a single operation. And here's the detail that tells you everything about the thinking behind it. The strike deliberately avoided the oil terminal itself. Storage tanks, loading equipment, the actual infrastructure that generates the country's export income, none of it was touched. Think about what that choice actually communicates. The message was not, "We are going to cut off your income tonight." The message was closer to this. We can see every part of your most valuable economic asset in complete detail. We just destroyed everything you built to protect it, and we are choosing, on purpose, not to touch the part that earns you money. That is not mercy. That is a demonstration of control. It says, we still have more we could do, and whether we do it is entirely our decision, not yours. A strike like that does not happen with a handful of aircraft dropping whatever is available. Erasing more than 90 separate positions in one night while carefully avoiding the storage tanks sitting right next to them requires precision-guided weapons, real-time targeting information, and long-range munitions capable of hitting a specific building from far away. It requires clearing enemy radar and air defenses first, so nothing can interfere with the strike as it happens. And it requires aerial refueling, because aircraft operating at this range from carriers or regional bases cannot stay in the air long enough without tankers supporting them. None of this is something you throw together overnight. It takes planning, staging, and positioning well in advance. After that March strike, Iran's leadership had a choice about how to read it, and by most accounts, they chose the reading that suited them, not the one that matched reality. They treated the strike as the ceiling, the worst that would happen, rather than as a warning shot with much more behind it. They assumed the war would keep grinding along familiar lines, strikes on air defenses and missile sites, absorbed and repeated, until eventually some kind of deal got negotiated. Except the American president had spent the weeks after that strike repeatedly floating something far bigger. In an interview in late March, he was asked directly whether the United States might actually take control of the island rather than just bombing its defenses. His answer, according to reports at the time, was that it was a real option on the table, not something being ruled out. Through the spring, He continued raising the idea publicly, warning that power plants, oil wells, and this same island could all be targeted if a deal was not reached, and shipping through the nearby strait was not restored. By June, the language had shifted from destroying to controlling, with comparisons drawn to how the United States has handled oil infrastructure disputes elsewhere. That is a very different threat than damaging a facility. That is a threat to take it over and run it. Military analysts who have studied what an actual takeover would require have been fairly direct about it. A real seizure would mean establishing complete control of the surrounding air and sea space first. Warships and aircraft locking down the area before any troops ever set foot on the island itself. And experts have been just as direct about the risk on the other side of that operation. The island sits well within range of artillery, and whatever missile or drone capability remains on the mainland, only 15 to 20 miles away. Taking it might be the straightforward part. Holding it under sustained pressure from that close is what turns a quick operation into a long, grinding commitment. Some analysts have suggested that putting American forces physically on Iranian soil would be one of the most psychologically significant moves of the entire war, which is exactly why it remains on the table without having been carried out yet. That was the backdrop heading into the summer. Iran had spent months hearing this same warning repeated, watched one threatened strike get called off in June following renewed talks, and treated that as proof the pressure had limits. Then July arrived, and a fragile pause in the fighting collapsed. Strikes resumed, and reports described renewed explosions on the same island, alongside strikes on Iran's largest island near the strait, a location tied to the country's coastal defense network. Iranian state media reported multiple blasts that night, and footage verified by international outlets showed fires and explosions further along the coast the same week, as part of a wave described by American officials as covering more than 80 separate targets inside the country. If you are finding this useful, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because this story keeps developing fast and I don't want you to miss the next update. This was the moment the idea that Iran had somehow forced the American president to back down needed to survive contact with reality, and it did not. The island that Iran had assumed was a closed chapter was hit again, inside a wider campaign that also brought back oil-related sanctions alongside the military pressure. The economic squeeze and the military squeeze were now running together, aimed at the same narrow stretch of coastline that keeps the country's finances functioning, and the pace has not slowed since. Over recent weeks, American forces have carried out consecutive nights of strikes without pause, something officials have confirmed publicly on multiple occasions. Then, in the middle of that stretch, Iranian missiles and drones struck a coalition airbase in Jordan. According to Central Command, American service members were killed defending against that attack, with additional troops wounded, and one reported missing before later being confirmed among the dead. This marked the first American combat deaths from Iranian fire in months, and it noticeably shifted the tone of the war overnight. The American president, asked about the deaths, called it a very sad thing and said it happened in service to the country. Within hours, not days, American forces answered with another night of strikes, this time explicitly naming the Revolutionary Guard as the direct target of the response. That is not vague language. That is the United States, saying clearly, we know who carried this out, and this response is aimed specifically at you. So here is where things stand based on the most recent reporting. According to sourcing from international outlets, the United States had already begun moving additional fighter jets and refueling tankers into the region before the Jordan attack even happened. That timing matters because it suggests preparation was already underway before the deadliest strike of recent weeks occurred. The same reporting suggests that the current strikes, aimed at reopening the strait to shipping, are also designed to degrade the specific Iranian capabilities that would need to be reduced before any larger operation could be attempted. Officials have described what might come next only as more complex operations. Careful language that stops just short of confirming exactly what is being planned, but strongly implies that a ground operation on the island, along with a strike on a heavily fortified underground facility tied to Iran's nuclear program, has moved from talk into active preparation. That underground facility cannot really be separated from the story of the island, because both have been raised in the same breath, as connected pieces of whatever comes next. Iranian officials have warned that striking the facility would widen the war significantly and trigger broader retaliation against American allies in the region, and at least one hardline Iranian publication has gone as far as threatening retaliation against American nuclear-related sites if that happens. Whether that kind of statement reflects a genuine plan, or simply rhetoric meant to project strength, is impossible to know for certain from the outside. But it tells you how seriously Tehran is treating the threat, and how much more dangerous the next stage of this war could become if that line gets crossed. It is also worth pausing here to acknowledge the human cost, because it is easy to get lost in strategy and hardware and forget that real people are dying on every side of this. According to the latest figures from American defense sources, the number of United States service members killed since this war began has climbed into the double digits, following the deaths in Jordan and a separate death during the disposal of an unexploded Iranian drone. Formal transfers of remains have taken place, and lawmakers in Washington have held hearings examining the cost and direction of the campaign, with proposals discussed that could give Congress more say over how much further the country goes. On the other side, tracking across the wider regional conflict, which now touches multiple countries beyond just Iran and the United States, puts casualties in the thousands, with estimates varying depending on the source. This is not a narrow, contained exchange anymore, if it ever really was one. And Kharg Island is not burning in isolation either. The same reporting window has flagged activity from Houthi forces in Yemen, with a standing blockade posture affecting shipping near another major choke point at the mouth of the Red Sea. Analysts tracking the wider conflict have pointed to Iran's electrical grid as a possible trigger point that could pull that separate front into more direct action. There is also continued diplomatic movement involving Lebanon, with reporting pointing to ongoing negotiation over troop withdrawals and pressure on armed groups there to disarm. Put all of this together, and you start to see the real shape of what is happening. This was never simply a two-country conflict. It is a much wider regional pressure system, with the island sitting at the center of the economic half of it, and the underground facility sitting at the center of the military half, while every other flashpoint across the region waits to see which piece moves first. Rising oil prices connected to this conflict do not stay contained to the region either. Higher crude prices tend to move quickly into fuel costs, shipping costs, and eventually the price of ordinary goods almost everywhere in the world. That is part of why this story keeps getting international attention well beyond the countries directly involved. A decision made about one small island in the Persian Gulf can end up shaping how much people pay at the pump on the other side of the planet months after the fact. So why does everything keep circling back to this one small stretch of coastline? Because it is the one lever that matters more than any missile site. A destroyed radar station can be rebuilt. A damaged command post can eventually be replaced. What cannot be easily replaced is nearly all of a country's export revenue disappearing overnight. Iran's mainland coastline in most places is too shallow for the largest oil tankers, which is exactly why this island was built into a deep water terminal in the first place, going back to construction that began more than 60 years ago. There is no real backup. Smaller facilities used during past conflicts were never built to handle anywhere close to the same volume. Some estimates suggest the terminal can load as many as 10 large tankers at once. You cannot recreate that kind of capacity somewhere else on short notice. So when officials talk about actually seizing the island, rather than simply striking it again, they are talking about taking direct physical control of the one choke point that no sanction, no blockade, and no round of diplomacy has ever fully been able to replace. And that is exactly what makes the entire narrative that Iran successfully broke the American president fall apart under any real scrutiny. What happened in June was never a permanent retreat. It was a pause, tied to a specific round of talks. And once those talks collapsed, the pressure did not simply return to where it had been before. It escalated past it. Naval enforcement against Iranian ports tightened further. Oil prices, which had dropped the moment that earlier strike was called off, climbed back up significantly, reversing a meaningful portion of the earlier decline. And hanging over all of it is a hard legal deadline tied to trade law, a temporary import surcharge, set to expire this week by operation of law, layered directly on top of a war that just recorded its first American combat deaths in months, on top of a standing threat against the island, and on top of a standing threat against the underground facility. 3 separate countdown clocks, all converging around roughly the same handful of days. If this kind of detailed breakdown is helping you actually understand what's happening in this war, do me a favor and share it with someone who's only seeing the headlines. That one small action genuinely helps this channel keep making videos like this. Let's talk briefly about what actually seizing the island would require in practice, because it is easy to picture it as something simple, and it really is not. According to retired military officials who have described the process publicly, the sequence would begin with establishing overwhelming control of the surrounding air and sea space, warships and fighter aircraft locking the area down completely before any troops are ever moved ashore by helicopter. Only once that dominance is secured would ground forces move in, likely with an ultimatum given to whatever defenders remain. That part, relatively speaking, may be the easier half, given how degraded Iran's air defenses in that specific area already are after repeated strikes. The harder half is what happens afterward. Holding the island means holding a position within range of coastal artillery and whatever missile and drone capability the Revolutionary Guard has managed to keep functional despite everything that has already been destroyed. Analysts who track Iran's military planning have pointed out that the country has spent decades specifically building the capability to keep foreign forces away from exactly this stretch of coastline. That is not something built in the past few months. It predates this entire war. So seizing the island might take a matter of hours. Holding it under sustained pressure from a coastline only 15 to 20 miles away could turn into a commitment lasting months or longer. And that is exactly the kind of open-ended presence that even the most hawkish voices in Washington appear cautious about fully committing to. Which brings us to the real strategic logic sitting underneath everything that has happened around this island since March. Striking the defenses while leaving the oil terminal untouched was never really about restraint for its own sake. It only means something if the threat behind it is completely credible. You show a country that you can erase 90 military positions in a single night while deliberately leaving its main source of income standing, and the message writes itself. We are choosing not to touch your revenue right now, and that choice belongs entirely to us, not to you. Iran had a real opportunity after that March strike to treat the restraint shown as an actual opening, a chance to negotiate seriously and de-escalate around the strait. Instead, by most available evidence, the choice made was to read that restraint as exhaustion rather than control, to mistake a demonstration of capability for a sign of weakness. And by the time the island's defenses were struck again in July, alongside renewed sanctions and an expanding target list that now reportedly includes parts of the electrical grid, the entire premise Tehran had been operating on, for months quietly fell apart. There was no bluff that got called. There was a demonstration that never actually got withdrawn, sitting there the whole time, waiting on a decision that has always belonged to Washington, not to Tehran. So where does this actually go from here? Nobody outside a very small circle of decision makers has a fully settled answer yet, and anyone claiming total certainty about what happens next is not being straight with you. But based on everything currently being reported, there are specific signals worth watching closely over the coming days, rather than vague speculation. Whether the strikes finally extend to Iran's electrical transmission network, something multiple reports have flagged as a possible trigger for widening the conflict along that separate Red Sea corridor, whether the remains recovered near the Jordan attack are formally confirmed, which would push the official death toll higher, whether lawmakers in Washington move forward with a vote that could place real limits on how much further this campaign can go without direct legislative approval, whether new strikes are reported deeper inside Iranian territory, suggesting the target list is creeping further inland rather than staying along the coast, and whether that trade deadline this week gets used as additional pressure or instead becomes a bargaining chip in exchange for concessions on shipping through the strait. Every one of these threads leads back to the same island. It is not a side story in this war anymore, if it ever was one. It is the mechanism. It is the thing that determines whether the current government can keep funding this fight at all. And right now, it is the single physical location where restraint and escalation are both sitting on the exact same 5 miles of coastline, waiting on a decision that has not been made yet, at least not publicly. Here's the piece that I think gets missed the most in the daily coverage of this war. This was never really just a story about oil, even though oil is what moves the markets and grabs the headlines. It is a story about how a government reads pressure and how consistently this particular government has misread nearly every signal since the war began. The opening strikes were treated as something that could be absorbed and outlasted. The March strike on the island was treated as a ceiling rather than a floor. A single paused strike in June was treated as proof that enough pressure would always force a retreat. And now, with several deadlines converging at once, a trade-related deadline, a standing threat against the country's most valuable economic asset, and a standing threat against a facility tied to its nuclear program, there are fewer and fewer ways left to misread the situation. There is a pattern worth naming clearly here, because it explains almost everything else in this story. Every government under this kind of pressure eventually faces a choice between two ways of reading the other side's restraint. One reading says they are holding back because they are running out of options. The other reading says they are holding back because they still have far more they have chosen not to use yet. Choosing the first reading feels good in the short term. It lets you tell your own people a story about strength and defiance. But choosing wrong on that specific question over and over is how a country ends up exactly where Iran appears to be right now, facing several deadlines at once instead of just one. At some point, perception has to catch up with reality. And the reality right now is that the pressure applied over these past several months has been demonstrated carefully, one restrained strike at a time, without ever suggesting there is a limit to how far it could still go. So here is the question I want to leave you with, because I think it matters more than any single strike report coming out this week. Was this small stretch of coastline always going to be the place where this war either ends or fully transforms into something much larger? Every thread we have walked through today, the oil, the casualties, the legal deadline, the military buildup already being reported, keeps pointing back to the exact same 5 miles of coral and coastline. That is not a coincidence, and I do not think it stays a slow-moving story for very much longer. I would genuinely like to know what you think happens next. Do you think a ground operation actually happens before this month is out? Or do you think this stays a threat that keeps getting renewed without ever being carried out? Do you think the underground facility gets struck before the island does, given how directly Iran has tied those two threats together in its own public statements? Or do you think the trade deadline this week ends up being the actual pressure point that forces some kind of deal before either operation is ever approved? All three of these paths appear to be on the table right now, based on the same reporting we have walked through, and none of them rule each other out. It is entirely possible that one path gets used as leverage while movement happens on another at the same time. Drop your prediction in the comments, because I have been following every piece of this since the war began, comparing official statements against independent reporting from multiple outlets, and I want to hear where you think the next few days actually take us. If this kind of breakdown helps you understand what is really happening here, subscribing means you will not miss the next update, and given how fast this is moving, there's a good chance the next chapter of this story is the biggest one yet. One last thing before you go. This is a fast-moving situation, the kind where facts on the ground can shift within a single day. Please treat everything here as an honest account of where things stood at the time this was made, not as the final word on how any of it ends. Thank you for watching all the way through, and I will see you in the next one.